My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 29 years old, and if you'd asked my family about me a year ago, they would have struggled to remember more than a vague sketch quiet. Strange, probably unemployed. That girl who dropped out of MIT and never really explained why. The one who stopped coming to the annual family reunions without warning or apology. But this summer, I came back. It had been 4 years since I last stepped foot on Aunt June's estate in Napa Valley, the Bennett family's unspoken cathedral of success. Every July, we gathered there under the guise of unity. But anyone who'd ever sat at that long white table knew the truth. It was a competition dressed up in linen napkins and rosé. Who got promoted? Who's driving what? Whose kids got into Ivy League? The real currency was comparison. And I had none to offer. Not then. This year. I arrived early. No grand entrance. No +1. No flashy outfit. Just me, in a fitted charcoal blazer and black jeans, blending in like a shadow. I could feel the air shift the moment I walked up the stone path. Polite shock, forced smiles, murmurs behind wine glasses. My sister Vanessa was the first to break ranks. Well, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Look who's decided to rejoin the living. She looked me up and down. No visible signs of failure. I'm impressed. I smiled, because I'd expected that. Vanessa always needed to land the first punch. She was a 2-time divorcee with a legal degree she barely used, and a 17-year-old TikTok famous daughter she couldn't control. If she wasn't belittling someone, she didn't know what to say. The others followed Uncle Greg, the patriarch in training who treated every reunion like a board meeting. Cousin Brandon, loud and oblivious, and of course, my parents, Raymond and Sheila Bennett, sitting near the head of the table as if they hadn't once told me I was wasting my life. My mother gave me the kind of brief smile you give a cashier. My father, a curt nod and nothing else. Dinner was served like always, too much, too formal, too rehearsed. I sat between Brandon and Aunt June, both of whom spent most of the meal talking about themselves. I barely touched the duck confit. I was waiting for the inevitable toast, waiting for the performance that always came with dessert. Sure enough, as the last plates were being cleared and the help poured espresso into tiny porcelain cups, my father rose with practiced ease. He tapped his spoon against the rim of his wine glass, commanding the kind of attention he lived for. A toast, he began, glancing around the table, to family, to legacy, and to those of us who've carried this name with purpose and built something worth celebrating. Then he looked directly at me, and to those of us who are still figuring it out. Polite laughter rippled through the table like static. My mother sipped her wine. Vanessa smirked. Greg leaned back, smug. And me, I didn't flinch, not anymore. I used to sit in that same chair and feel myself shrink, boiling with shame I didn't have the words to express. But not tonight. Tonight. I laughed. A quiet, honest laugh that sliced through the awkward silence like a scalpel. Then I stood, slowly, drawing every eye as I unbuttoned my blazer. My hands didn't shake. I let the fabric fall open, revealing the sleek emblem stitched onto my blouse, Novaris Systems. The room froze. It took a moment for them to register what they were seeing. The silver and indigo logo meant little to most of them except Greg, whose face drained of color, Vanessa, who fumbled her wine glass, and Brandon, whose eyes widened as he sputtered mid-sip. I spoke calmly. I wasn't planning on saying anything. I thought tonight was about family, not business. I let the silence hang for a beat, then continued. But since we're making toasts, Novaris closed its acquisition of Bennett Strategic Holdings last Thursday. Full buyout. The company is now under my leadership. The effect was immediate. Brandon coughed violently. Greg straightened like he'd been electrocuted. My father squinted as if reading an email he didn't understand. That's not possible, he said finally. voice tight. You couldn't have. I did. I cut in. Tone still composed. 3 years ago, I launched Novaris. We built a software suite that outperformed your systems in efficiency, security, and scale. While you were chasing third-party contracts, we were studying your entire infrastructure. Greg's face turned crimson. You're bluffing. That's not how acquisitions work. You'd be surprised what's possible when your CTO leaks your inefficiencies and your shareholders are hungry for new leadership. I replied, I'm not here to debate it. Greg, the deal is done. We'll announce it publicly Monday morning. And then I did something I'd rehearsed in my head 1,000 times. I reached into my bag and placed a thick envelope in the center of the table. Inside are transition memos, audit schedules, and updated organizational charts. You'll find some familiar names are missing. My father stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. You did this behind our backs. You did it first, I said quietly. When you dismissed me, when you told me I was a disappointment, when you said I didn't have what it takes, you all did this. And now you're just reaping the results. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was explosive. Vanessa looked like she wanted to scream. Greg was muttering something under his breath. Brandon was pale, sweating. My mother finally looked up from her wine, mouth slightly open. But I didn't wait for a reply. I stood straighter, buttoned my jacket again, and said, You wanted to toast to legacies. Here's mine. It doesn't carry your fingerprints, and it doesn't need your permission. Then I turned, heels clicking softly against the stone patio, the night air brushing my skin like a quiet applause. And behind me, no one said a word. But I knew the silence wouldn't last long. I didn't look back as I walked to the driveway. I didn't need to. I could feel their eyes boring into my back, their silence louder than any outburst. The same family who used to make jokes at my expense was now choking on theirs. I passed the lineup of overpriced vehicles, Vanessa's leased BMW with a Boss B vanity plate, Greg's massive Ford Raptor that had never seen a speck of dirt, and my father's blood-red Corvette, still polished like a trophy he'd never earned. My own car, a simple charcoal gray Tesla. I drove not for show, but silence waited at the edge of the estate, like a silent partner in my rebellion. When I slid into the seat, I didn't turn the engine on right away. I just sat there, letting the weight of the moment settle. My phone buzzed, screen lighting up with names I hadn't heard from in months. First was Vanessa. No message, just a missed call. Then, Greg, what the hell did you do? Followed by Brandon's predictable plea. This can't be real. You're not seriously going to fire me, right? And finally, my mother Claire. Call me. Your father is furious. We need to talk. I didn't respond. Not yet. I needed the silence. Back at my apartment in San Francisco, minimalist. Clean. All white and chrome. I poured a glass of bourbon and stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker like blinking thoughts. I should have felt vindicated, triumphant even. But what I felt was a strange kind of stillness, like the wind had finally stopped howling, and I could finally hear myself think. I hadn't taken over their company for revenge. Not exactly. I did it because no one ever believed I could. Because when I told them I was building something, they scoffed. When I failed because I did fail. More than once they called it proof. Not concern, not love. Proof that I wasn't enough. What they didn't know was how many nights I cried into coding sheets, how many jobs I worked dog walking, meal delivery, tutoring ungrateful rich kids just to keep my dream alive. They had safety nets. I had concrete. And now I had leverage. By Monday morning, the press release went live. Novaris Systems finalizes acquisition of Bennett Strategic Holdings in landmark private buyout. The shockwaves hit fast. Industry forums exploded. Tech bloggers speculated about the mystery female founder who came out of nowhere. But inside the company, things moved faster. I'd already placed my people quiet, competent professionals who knew the truth. My CFO, Nadia, had worked with me since my startup days, and she executed the internal transition with surgical precision. HR received the updated restructure memos by 9:01 a.m. sharp. Department heads were reshuffled. Brandon's name was quietly moved into a performance review category flagged for inconsistent output. At 11:07 a.m., Veronica clearly panicked, submitted her resignation. It wasn't an apology, just a flat statement claiming irreconcilable vision differences. Translation, she knew she was next. I let it process without comment. She left the building with a Moncler coat over her arm and 2 unauthorized USB drives in her purse. Both were wiped remotely before she hit the parking lot. By Wednesday, Greg tried to call an emergency board meeting. Too late. The board he used to control was already replaced. Every vote accounted for. Every position earned. Not inherited. He stood in that glass conference room, red-faced and flailing, while my executive assistant calmly handed him a termination letter in a sealed envelope. He didn't go quietly. "This company is a family legacy," he shouted. "No," I said from the door, watching him pack his desk through the glass wall. It was a family weapon. And now it's a platform. My father didn't call. Not that day, not the next. But on Friday morning, my phone lit up with a number I hadn't saved in years. I let it ring and ring and ring. He didn't leave a voicemail. But 15 minutes later, a text arrived. Just 2 words. "Let's talk." No greeting, no apology, no punctuation. Just an edict. The same way he used to summon me to discuss my future when I was 17 and had the audacity to choose computer science over pre-law. I didn't reply. I needed to know why he wanted to talk. Saturday morning came with clouds and the quiet hum of unease. I found myself pacing my living room, my fingers grazing the edge of the manila envelope I had handed him days earlier. I pictured him tearing it open, rage growing with every line he didn't understand. What did he think? That I built all of this just to hurt him? He never saw me. Not really. I could have cured cancer. And he'd still say, "What's your plan B?" By Sunday afternoon, I was tired of guessing. I called him. He answered immediately. "Claire," he said, flatly. "You said you wanted to talk." A pause, then a sharp breath. "You blindsided us." I did what I had to. I built that company. You managed it. I corrected. Built is a strong word for someone who inherited 70% of his clients from Grandpa. He fell silent. Then, "You always were ungrateful." That stung, more than I wanted it to. I inhaled deeply, slow and steady. "I wanted you to be proud of me. For years. That's all I wanted. But you didn't see effort. You only saw results. And even then, only if they aligned with your idea of success." "Claire, I said some things." "Everyone did," I cut in. "But it's what you didn't say that hurt more. When I got that grant, when my first beta launch passed 100K users, you didn't call, you didn't ask, you just waited to see if I'd fail." His voice dropped lower. "Tired now. You really gonna shut all of us out?" I let the question float. Then I said, "That depends on whether you think showing up now erases a decade of silence." There was no rebuttal, just breathing. "Dad," I said finally, "this wasn't revenge, it was survival. You all made the rules. I just learned how to win by them." I ended the call. My hands were steady, for the first time. I didn't feel like a daughter begging to be seen. I felt like a CEO who had earned every piece of her power. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning, because legacies don't crumble quietly. They scream on their way down. The fallout came in waves. Not loud, not explosive, at least, not at first. It was quieter than that, more insidious, like the slow creaking of beams before a collapse. It started Monday morning, 9:01 a.m., when my legal team executed the final phase of the transition: department memos, leadership reviews, budget reallocations. Every thread that held the old regime together was pulled with surgical care. Nothing rash, just precision. The Oversight Committee, built in secret during my merger phase, issued its first round of audits. Unsurprisingly, several names from the reunion table appeared: Vanessa, Greg, even Brandon, whose files practically glowed red under performance flags. Each one of them had assumed immunity by proximity, but proximity wasn't merit. By 10:37 a.m., Brandon's keycard access had been quietly restricted to one floor. He noticed it the moment he tried to ride the elevator to the top level where his father used to roam with unchecked authority. Security redirected him politely. He left the building that afternoon in a daze, shoulders hunched like a man who had just learned gravity applied to him, too. Veronica's departure wasn't graceful either. Though her resignation had been processed, she'd still tried to walk out with confidential client portfolios and 2 laptops tucked in her Balenciaga tote. It had already locked them down, wiped and logged. She called it sabotage. I called it protocol. Greg tried to rally his old allies, the ones he'd promoted out of loyalty. Not performance, but they knew the tide had turned. Self-preservation is faster than loyalty in corporate America. One by one, they ghosted him, emails unanswered, meetings declined. Within 48 hours, Greg was alone, a general with no army. By midweek, I was summoned politely, formally to a closed-door shareholder forum, not to be questioned. Exactly. More. Evaluated. A few of the older investors wanted reassurance that I wasn't driven by personal vendettas, that this wasn't a power grab fueled by family drama. I came prepared. Slide decks, growth projections, a team of advisors who had once ignored my emails now nodding respectfully. I walked them through the turnaround plan: leaner operations, culture reset, open innovation initiatives. Every word I spoke chipped away at the caricature my family had painted of me. The quiet dreamer who never finished anything had become the architect of their future revenue. At the end of the meeting, one of the senior investors, a retired banker named Wallace, leaned forward and asked, "And your father, where does he fit in all of this?" I met his gaze without flinching. He doesn't. The room went still. Wallace nodded slowly, and nothing more was said. Later that night, I received a handwritten letter delivered via courier. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. My mother's. It wasn't long or dramatic, just a folded page. "Claire, I watched it all happen and did nothing. That's my guilt. Your father loved control more than he ever loved being right. I loved peace more than I loved justice. I don't expect forgiveness. But I want you to know I see you now. Your strength, your pain, your power. Mom." I didn't cry. Not right away. I just held the letter for a long time, feeling the weight of it, of her silence all these years, and the quiet rupture her words now caused. Forgiveness is complicated. It isn't loud like anger. It's quiet, hesitant, and terrifying because it means letting go of the armor that kept you alive. I placed the letter in my drawer, not in the trash, not on display, just there, waiting. By Friday, the company was running differently, not smoother yet, but cleaner, like a wound being stitched up properly for the first time. Junior staff no longer whispered during lunch. They spoke up in meetings. Engineers submitted ideas without needing executive approval first. It was working not just in metrics, but in morale. Then came the unexpected. Brandon showed up. Not at the office, security had strict orders, but outside the building. He waited near the coffee truck parked on the curb, holding 2 cups. I almost didn't stop. But then I saw his face, and I knew he wasn't here for a second chance. He was here for something else. Closure. I walked over, took the coffee, nodded once. He didn't say sorry. I didn't expect him to. Instead, he asked, "Do you ever feel like the villain?" I sipped. No. But I know that's how people like you prefer to see me. It's easier than admitting you got outplayed. He winced, but he didn't argue. "I never hated you," he said after a pause. "I just thought you'd always be background noise." "That's the problem," I replied, voice low. "You all mistook silence for weakness." He left without another word, and I let him. Because the next battle wasn't his. It was Greg's. That Sunday, my inbox received an encrypted attachment, anonymous sender, but the contents made it clear whistleblower documents detailing years of internal kickbacks under Greg's tenure, vendor manipulation, consultant fraud, ghost payroll entries. He'd buried it all under family trust accounts and shell companies, but he hadn't expected internal audits with teeth. I sent it directly to the legal department, with one instruction: no protection. By the following Wednesday, Greg was under formal investigation. The board suspended all his stock privileges. His company email was locked. He called me 3 times, left one voicemail. "Claire, don't burn everything. You'll regret this." I didn't respond. Because regret was for those who didn't learn. And I was done playing student to men who mistook cruelty for power. But the war wasn't over. And the final shot would come from the last place I expected. The voicemail from Greg had barely faded from my phone screen when another name appeared, one I hadn't seen in over a year. Emily, my cousin, Greg's daughter, and once, the only family member who had ever really seen me for who I was. She wasn't like the others. Or, at least, she hadn't been. We were close as kids. She'd slip me cookies under the table when I was grounded at family gatherings. Whisper jokes during tense dinners. Tell me I mattered long before I believed it. But life diverged. College, careers, alliances, and eventually, silence. Her message was simple. "We need to talk, not about him, about you." I didn't know what to expect when I met her at the little cafe on Mercer. The one we used to joke was too expensive for anyone who wasn't trying to impress someone. She was already seated when I arrived, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea, eyes shielded behind sunglasses that looked too big for her face. She removed them as I sat down. Her eyes were tired, but clear. "I know what my father did," she said without preamble. I knew, some of it. Not the specifics, not the money, but the way he talked about people like you were dangerous just because you didn't ask for permission to succeed. I started paying attention. I stayed quiet, let her keep going. "I found files. On you. On your company. He was tracking you months before the merger." That caught my breath. "Why?" "Because he knew." She said simply, "He knew you were going to rise. And he wanted to be ready to crush you." There it was, the part of the story I hadn't seen. The part I hadn't even thought to look for. This wasn't just neglect or arrogance. This had been war, long before I stepped onto the battlefield. Emily slid a flash drive across the table. Emails, transfer records, meeting logs. Enough to bury him if what you have isn't airtight already. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because I don't want to become him," she said, voice trembling. "And because I still remember who you were before they turned you into a ghost." I took the drive, not out of vengeance, out of clarity. That night, I stared at the drive for hours before plugging it in. Inside a web of manipulation so wide it made me nauseous. He'd redirected contracts to shell vendors under his name, rejected internal promotions for engineers who threatened his influence, even interfered with external merger bids just to slow me down. And the worst part, He'd done it all while smiling at me over family dinners, while giving toasts, while calling me kiddo. I compiled the files, added them to the audit team's dossier. No commentary, no emotional flair, just facts. And then I went quiet. For 2 days. No messages, no statements, just a stillness that echoed louder than any announcement. Until Friday morning, when the hammer fell. Greg was formally suspended. A press release, clean and clinical, cited compliance violations and breach of fiduciary duty. He'd fought it, threatened lawsuits, even tried spinning the media. But the evidence spoke louder than spin. He resigned in disgrace by Monday. And still, I felt nothing, no glee, no vindication, just a strange, hollow sense of justice. But the world doesn't let you rest for long. 2 weeks later, a headline broke through every newsfeed: Morningside ex-exec faces federal probe after whistleblower documents surface. It wasn't me who leaked it. That much I can say. But someone had. Maybe someone on the oversight team. Maybe Emily. Maybe justice itself had finally grown tired of waiting. I watched the media circus unfold with quiet detachment. Commentators speculated. Former colleagues scrambled to distance themselves. Investors called meetings. And through it all, I stayed calm. Until my mother called. Not to scream, not to beg, but to ask a question I wasn't ready for. "Is this what you wanted, Claire?" I was silent. She tried again. I read the article. I saw the pictures. "Do you feel better?" It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't guilt-tripping. It was just a mother, unsure where her daughter had gone. "No," I said eventually. "I feel responsible." She sighed. "That's the difference between you and them." I hung up soon after. Not in anger, just drained. Because that was the weight of legacy, not the money, not the titles, the guilt, the inheritance of silence. And silence, I'd learned, can rot louder than words ever could. The next weekend, I returned to my apartment to find a letter slipped under my door. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. My father's. The last person I hadn't heard from. "Claire, I won't insult you with excuses. I taught you that strength meant silence, that love looked like expectations. But I see now. It looked like control. I don't know who you are anymore, but I know you are no longer mine to shape. And maybe that's the greatest legacy I've failed to give you: freedom. Dad." For the first time in years, I cried. Not because it was apology. It wasn't. It was surrender. And somehow, that meant more. But just when I thought the chapter had closed, a knock came at my office door. Unannounced. Unexpected. And behind it stood someone I never imagined would cross my threshold again. Vanessa, with a folder in her hands, and a proposal that would change everything. Vanessa stood in my doorway like a ghost wearing heels, impeccably dressed, posture rigid, but with an uncertainty in her eyes that didn't match the way she used to command a room. The last time we'd spoken, she'd called me a cautionary tale in designer shoes. Now, she clutched a plain navy folder like it held the last of her dignity. I didn't ask her to sit. She did anyway. She slid the folder across my desk, but didn't speak. I opened it slowly, expecting a resignation, maybe a plea for clemency. What I saw instead stopped me cold. It was a blueprint, not metaphorically an actual product blueprint, annotated and rough, but brilliant. A sustainable energy prototype, one I recognized. Not because I'd seen it before, but because years ago, we used to talk about this exact idea while we were still undergrads, sitting in dorm lounges with caffeine-stained notebooks and impossible dreams. "You built this?" I asked, glancing up. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. After the fallout, I had nothing to lose. So I went back to building. Not for the company, for me. Vanessa had always been the most talented in our cohort. Sharp, visionary. But she had also been quick to climb, to compromise, to side with the loudest voices if it meant upward momentum. She betrayed me once, not by sabotage, but by staying silent when they mocked me, excluded me, discarded me. Silence that hurt more than outright war. And now I asked, why bring this here? Because it's ready. And I'm not. Her voice cracked. I can't lead this. Not anymore. But you already built something no one thought possible. You're the only one I trust to make sure this isn't used for PR or power games. For a long moment, I just looked at her, the girl who had once watched me fall and said nothing, now asking me to lift something she couldn't carry. Why now, I finally asked. She stared at the floor. Because I remember who we were before they taught us to be afraid of each other. That night, I barely slept, not from anxiety, from clarity. The truth is, I'd spent so long tearing down the old house, I forgot I'd need something to build next. This was it, the second beginning, not driven by revenge, but by responsibility. I called a meeting the next morning, the department heads, legal, R&D. I showed them the prototype, the specs, the vision. I told them what we could build together. No more nepotism, no more performance theater, just innovation, rooted in integrity. They were quiet at first, processing, calculating. And then, one by one, they nodded. We greenlit the project within a week, rebranded a division for it, and I named Vanessa as project co-lead. Not out of charity, because she earned it. Not for what she'd done, but for what she dared to do next. Still, healing doesn't come in press releases or contracts. It came weeks later, at a tech summit in Chicago, when a panel moderator introduced me as Claire Lancaster, the disruptor who inherited a kingdom and chose to rebuild it brick by brick. I laughed, not at the compliment, at the absurdity that anyone thought I'd inherited anything. After the panel, a young woman approached me, probably early 20s, nervous, holding a worn notepad like it was armor. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "How did you keep going when everyone thought you were nothing?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at her, not at her clothes or her resume, or the lanyard badge hanging around her neck, but at her eyes, the way they flickered with both doubt and hope. "You don't," I finally said. "You just start walking, and one day, you look back and realize they were all watching from the sidelines, because they couldn't imagine someone like you would keep moving." She smiled, not wide, but grateful. And I saw a piece of myself standing there, scribbling dreams in the margins of someone else's spotlight. That night, I returned to my apartment smaller than you'd expect for someone in my position. No trophy walls, no glass plaques, just shelves of books I actually read, and a kitchen that smelled like cardamom tea. There was a letter waiting in my mailbox. Same thick paper, same crisp envelope, same shaky handwriting. My mother again. "Claire, your father moved out last week. I don't say that for sympathy, only clarity. He never recovered from the loss of control, not of the company, of you. I think he's trying to find himself in the silence. Maybe we both are. I'm starting therapy. It's late, I know. But maybe some gardens bloom in autumn. Just know, I planted this one thinking of you." I folded the letter carefully, placed it in the drawer with the others. Because some stories don't end with final acts or explosive showdowns. Some end with soft echoes. And grow again. 3 months later, I RSVP'd to the family reunion. Not to gloat. To see what had changed. Aunt Lydia greeted me first. She hugged me longer than expected. "You look solid," she said, with that odd warmth Midwestern women reserve for weatherproof furniture. Brandon was there too. He didn't meet my eyes, just offered a curt nod before disappearing toward the drinks. Veronica didn't come. Greg, naturally, wasn't invited. My father showed up late, wore a blazer too stiff for July, sat in the far corner like a guest in someone else's home. And that's exactly what it had become. I didn't toast that night, didn't make speeches. But when someone tapped their glass and asked if anyone wanted to say a few words about how far we've come, I simply stood and said, "We can't control where we're born, or to whom. But we can decide what we carry forward. I'm not here to remember what was. I'm here to build what's next." Then I sat down. Simple, unshaking. Afterward, my cousin Nora found me. She'd brought her girlfriend for the first time and introduced her with shy pride. "You made it easier," she whispered, "just by being loud when I couldn't be." And in that moment, I realized something they'd never taught me. Vindication isn't always dramatic. Sometimes, it looks like someone else finally breathing easy. And that's how I knew. I hadn't just rewritten my story. I'd given them permission to rewrite theirs too. Story 2, I was 21, a junior in college, and had spent most of that chilly November weekend buried in research papers. My mother had just come home from her shift at the local market when she mentioned Dad's work laptop had caught a bug again. It wasn't the first time. My father, Greg Kovalenko, co-owned a small but busy shoe boutique in Chicago with his longtime friend Doug. He wasn't tech-savvy, and I was often the designated in-house IT. So I brewed a cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the machine. The screen blinked with pop-ups, obvious adware. A few scans later, I found the culprit, a trail of adult websites, riddled with malware. I sighed. Gross. But sadly not shocking. Men his age weren't exactly known for their browsing restraint. Still, something felt off. I opened the downloads folder. Hundreds of files. At first, I assumed it was the usual stuff, but then I noticed a pattern. Folder after folder labeled with dates, inside photos. Dozens of them, all feet, some bare, some in heels, some mid-try-on in the boutique. Most candid, all women, some clearly unaware they were being photographed. My stomach dropped. These weren't stock images or screenshots. These were taken inside his store. The backdrop was unmistakable, the blue velvet fitting chairs. The faux wood display rack he proudly built himself. For a moment, I froze. My pulse thudded like a snare drum. I clicked through the images one after another, hoping they would eventually end, hoping they were perhaps from a strange Pinterest board. But no. Then, I found a folder marked Special. Inside were images not only of feet, but of women partially undressed. Shoes featured prominently, always. One woman was clearly in the back room of the shop. My father had always called that space private. My throat tightened. This was no mistake, no idle curiosity. It was deliberate, systematic, and sick. At first, I couldn't breathe. I slammed the lid of the laptop shut, stood up, and walked out the back door. I paced the alley in the cold for almost 15 minutes. Tears stinging my eyes, not from heartbreak, but humiliation. How had I not known? How had we lived all these years with this rot festering beneath the surface? Greg, the man who packed my lunches and gave me talks about respecting women, had turned his store into a hunting ground. And I had just opened Pandora's laptop. But the question wasn't only what to do, it was who to tell. I couldn't ignore what I saw. Yet confronting my father felt dangerous. He was a man of silence, of rage masked in reason. My mother, she had lived with him for 30 years. How could she not know? And if she did, had she hidden it to protect us? The line between truth and betrayal had blurred in an instant. I closed my eyes and replayed his voice in my head. Warm and authoritative family means privacy, loyalty. Those words, once a comfort, now sounded like chains. But I knew this couldn't stay secret. Not anymore. And so I walked back inside, picked up my phone, and texted my mom, "Can we talk in private?" Her reply came instantly. "Come to my room." I didn't know then that what she was about to tell me would shatter me even more than what I had seen. I sat on the edge of my mother's bed, laptop still warm in my bag, heart pounding like it would crack through my ribs. She closed the door softly behind us, then turned and looked at me with the kind of worry that comes from a place beyond words. She knew. I hadn't said a word yet, but she knew something was coming. "What is it?" she asked, folding her arms not out of anger, but as if bracing herself. I told her everything, about the viruses, the photos, the folder named Special. Her face turned pale by the second, but what hit me hardest was not the shock. It was the way she bit her lip and whispered, "Oh God, he still does it." For a moment, the air drained from the room. I blinked. "What do you mean still?" She sat down beside me, hands trembling, and confessed the truth I didn't expect to hear. 2 years ago, she'd caught him. It wasn't from a virus or an accidental click. She had been suspicious for a while. Greg had left his email open on the family tablet. She saw messages he had sent asking strangers online for pictures of their feet. Not just random women he had tried to trade, to bargain, to buy. She checked his phone after that, hoping it was a one-time slip. It wasn't. She found photos from the boutique, from the back room, the same blue-fitting chairs. She confronted him. Of course, Greg denied it at first, then caved. He told her it was just a side thing, a fetish he never acted on physically. "It's not like I'm cheating," he'd said. But she wasn't convinced. She begged him to stop, to get help, to understand how sick it was to take pictures of unaware customers and, God forbid, profit from them. He promised. She believed him. Or maybe she wanted to. Now her eyes brimmed with tears, not just for what he'd done, but for what she didn't stop. I told myself it was over. She said, "I made excuses. We'd been married so long. We'd survived worse in our home country." I thought, maybe I was the one being dramatic. I didn't blame her. I couldn't. But I could see the weight on her shoulders, heavier than anything I'd ever imagined she carried. She told me that she started checking his phone after that day, but never his laptop. And that's where he got smarter. He used cloud uploads, deleted traces, hid his files behind folders named for invoices or supplier lists. She never had access to his work computer. And so, he continued, silently, relentlessly. It was then I asked her something I didn't know I'd been holding back. "Do you think Doug, his business partner, knows?" Her lips tightened. She looked away, then nodded. "Yes, he knows, because they do it together." My stomach flipped. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, clearly torn. "After I confronted your father that first time, I followed him to the shop, not to spy, just to see. I overheard them talking in the back room. Doug wasn't surprised. He was advising him on camera angles." She shuddered, and I could tell how much this had cost her to keep quiet. They take pictures of customers' feet, sometimes even videos, and sell them online. They made a whole business out of it, a side hustle. He told me we should be grateful, that it paid for your brother's braces. My skin crawled. The boutique, the place my father loved like a second home, was a front. And Doug, the man who once gave me my first job helping with inventory, was an accomplice. I asked her why she didn't tell anyone, why she didn't warn the women. She broke. Because I was scared. Because I didn't know what to do. Because I thought maybe he'd stop. And because part of me still hoped he could be the man I married. In that moment, I felt like a child again, powerless, suspended between disbelief and fury. The man who had tucked me in at night, who called me his little engineer, had built a secret life layered in shame, and my mother, who had always seemed composed and self-assured, had carried this knowledge like a silent wound. We were both bleeding, just quietly. But I wasn't a child anymore, and silence wouldn't protect us. Not this time, that night. I couldn't sleep. My room, once a haven of posters and half-read books, suddenly felt foreign. Every quiet creak of the floor, every flicker of light from passing cars outside stirred paranoia. My thoughts spun like loose screws. I kept replaying Mom's words. They made money off strangers' bodies, and called it harmless. Harmless. That word rattled inside my skull. My father had always preached about dignity, self-respect, earning things the right way. He said those things while secretly violating people's trust and their privacy. By morning, the weight of silence was unbearable. I needed answers. Not from my mother, she had already borne too much. I needed to hear it from him, face to face. I waited until he got back from the store around 7 p.m., the same way he always did. Like it was any normal day, I stopped him just inside the front door. "We need to talk," I said. He looked confused for a moment, then tried to smile. "About what?" But I didn't let him play dumb. I showed him the file I'd recovered. I asked him straight up if what I had seen was recent, and if Doug knew. There was a pause, that short, dense silence before someone lies or confesses, and he chose the former. "What are you talking about?" he said, trying to sound amused. "Those are just product reference photos, training material." I wanted to scream. Instead, I handed him a printout, one of the images that had timestamps from only 3 weeks ago. Training material for what exactly? "Dad?" His face fell. The lie had cracked. I watched him try to rebuild a response from the ruins. He reached for justifications that it wasn't illegal, that they never touched anyone, that it was just a fetish, not a crime. He said Doug handled most of the uploads, that it was his thing, and he just helped with content, as if that made it better. He tried to spin it as harmless side income again. "You don't understand," he said. "Business is hard. No one gets hurt. It's not like we filmed anything sexual. That's when I lost it. You took photos of women without their consent. You profited off their bodies, their trust, and you think the fact that it wasn't explicit makes it okay." I wasn't shouting, but my voice shook with rage. He stood there, arms crossed, suddenly defensive. "I took care of this family. You think your scholarships and your brother's job would have been enough if I didn't hustle." That word hustle felt like poison. I told him what Mom knew, that she had caught him before, that she knew everything, and that this time, she was done. For a split second, he looked like a cornered animal. Then he scoffed. She always overreacted. She never understood business, or me. I realized in that moment that my father, the man I'd once admired, was never going to take real responsibility. He saw himself as the victim, the misunderstood genius trying to make it work. That broke something in me I hadn't even known was still whole. I walked away, but before I closed my bedroom door, I called over my shoulder, "She's talking to a lawyer." That stopped him cold. I didn't need to say which lawyer. He knew. The following week was a blur. Mom filed for divorce, quietly, without drama, just papers and signatures. But the emotional noise inside our house was deafening. Dad avoided us, sulking in his own corners. My sister moved back home temporarily. My brother transferred his job to a local office, for the first time in a long while. Our fractured family began forming new bonds, not around him, but around healing. around truth. And then something unexpected happened. A letter arrived, not from an attorney, but from the Department of Consumer Protection. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint about unauthorized surveillance and non-consensual photography at a local shoe boutique. An inspection was scheduled. I didn't ask Mom if she reported it. She didn't ask me either. But the truth had started moving, like a tide you couldn't stop. The inspector came on a Wednesday morning, a woman in a neat gray blazer, clipboard in hand, with a badge clipped to her belt that said, Consumer Protection Services. Doug, my father's business partner, was already at the store when she arrived. I wasn't there, but later that night, I heard the whole story from my mom. The inspector was polite but firm. She had a list of concerns, questions about store policies, security cameras, data storage. She asked to see all devices used for in-store photography phones, computers, laptops. My father refused. Claimed he needed time to prepare documentation. Doug looked pale. The inspector didn't push then, but she left with a warning she'd be back in 3 days with a warrant if needed. That night, the house was silent, not peaceful, just quiet. Like a storm was charging in the distance. I found my dad in the garage, sitting in the car with the door open, the engine off. I asked him if he was going to cooperate. His response was flat. They don't have anything on me. It's all just feet. As if that line somehow erased the breach of consent. As if objectifying strangers wasn't a violation. He didn't understand or refused to understand that what he did had hurt people. He wasn't just hiding anymore. He was rewriting the narrative in his own mind. The next day, he didn't go to work. Doug showed up at our house instead. I didn't expect to see him. He'd always been distant, the kind of man who rarely made eye contact with anyone under 30. But this time, he looked nervous. He asked to speak to my father alone. They argued for a long time in the garage. I couldn't hear most of it, but I caught snippets. You brought this on us. They'll find the cloud. You promised it was secure. When Doug left, he didn't say goodbye. Just slammed the door and peeled out of our driveway like it was on fire. The next morning, the inspector returned, this time, with 2 other agents and a signed warrant. They seized the shop's laptop, a backup drive hidden behind the register, and even one of the fitting room security cameras. The fallout was fast. Within a week, both my dad and Doug were being investigated for unlawful surveillance and selling non-consensual images online. A few local news outlets picked it up. Our last name, once just a name, became a whisper in grocery stores and gas stations. At school, I became that girl, the one whose dad took creepy foot pictures. I could feel it in the way people's eyes avoided mine. Some classmates were kind. One even brought me coffee and didn't say a word. Just sat beside me while I tried to hold it together. But the damage was done. My father's shame had become mine by proximity. My mother tried to shield me. But how do you protect someone from whispers and search results? I started therapy around that time. I needed help sorting out the mess in my head. Not just about what he did, but about the man I thought he was. For most of my life, my dad had been stern, sure, but he was present. He drove me to college interviews, helped me pick out a used car. He cried when I got my scholarship. And yet, that same man had objectified hundreds of women, sold images of their feet for profit, and never saw them as people. That contradiction haunted me. How could the same hands that tucked me in also hold a camera with such predatory purpose? Weeks turned to months. The divorce was finalized. My mom sold her half of the house and rented a small condo downtown. My siblings and I helped her move. My brother offered to stay with her until she felt settled. I visited often, each time noticing how much lighter she seemed, like a shadow had lifted. As for my father, He moved in with an uncle upstate. We haven't spoken since the week of the investigation. He sent a few texts, defensive ones, mostly. Never an apology. Never an acknowledgement of what he'd done to the women he photographed, or to his own family. He called it a witch hunt. He said we had betrayed him. But deep down, I think he knows that something irreparable broke between us. And maybe, just maybe, he's starting to realize that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. The summer passed in slow motion. Our home, once echoing with the hum of everyday life, my father's heavy footsteps, my mother's kitchen clatter, my sister's off-key humming, had gone quiet. There was no yelling, no more confrontation, just a heavy, uneasy calm. It was the sound of something that had broken and would never be put back together. My mother had settled into her new apartment, and for the first time, I noticed her sleeping through the night without medication. There were no more hushed arguments behind closed doors, no more midnight tears muffled by the hum of the bathroom fan. But for me, peace didn't come as easily. I couldn't stop thinking about the women, the ones in the photographs. Some were just feet in sandals, heels, sneakers taken without consent, their owners unaware they were being cataloged like merchandise. I'd found a folder labeled favorites. Some images had cropped backgrounds, enhancing the focus on toes, arches, anklets. It was clinical in how it reduced people to parts. I often wondered if I'd passed one of those women at the grocery store, or sat behind her in a class, or if she'd smiled at me while trying on shoes, not knowing she was being watched and archived. And that thought, it never let me rest. Doug's name made the news again. The investigation had uncovered encrypted folders on his personal computer. Worse than we expected. Some of the photos dated back almost a decade. A class action lawsuit was brewing. Several women who had visited their store were speaking to legal counsel, trying to identify whether they'd been violated. A detective contacted my mom to ask if she had ever witnessed any unusual behavior during visits to the store. She answered honestly. She told them everything about the cloud uploads, the laptop files, the arguments, the fetish. They thanked her, told her she might be subpoenaed. She took it with surprising strength. And yet, through it all, I kept waiting for guilt to crush me for being the one who opened the laptop, the one who peeled back the ugly truth. But guilt never came, only clarity. We hadn't broken our family. My father had. With every lie he told, every woman he photographed, every excuse he made, I had simply turned on the light in a room that had been dark for too long. One afternoon, I got a call from him. I let it go to voicemail. His voice was calmer than I expected. "I heard from your aunt you're doing well." "That's good. I hope you understand. I only did what I thought was necessary. For the family." I deleted the message, not out of anger, out of exhaustion. He still hadn't grasped the magnitude of what he had done. He still framed it as sacrifice instead of violation. And I realized he may never see the truth. Not really. Therapy helped. Slowly. I started naming things I hadn't dared to name before betrayal. Disillusionment. Grief. I realized I wasn't just mourning who my father had become. I was mourning the father I thought I had. The man who had shielded me from bullies. Who once taught me how to ride a bike in the middle of a parking lot at dusk. That version of him still lived in my memory like a ghost, and I didn't know how to reconcile the two. College applications became my focus. I was determined to leave this city, to build something untouched by the rot my father left behind. I got accepted into a university across the country. When I told my mother, she cried not because she was sad, but because she finally saw the cycle break. She said, "I stayed silent too long. I thought protecting your image of him was the same as protecting you. But it wasn't. I should have told you years ago." I hugged her. "You told me when it mattered. I whispered. Before I left, I returned to the shoe store once. It was boarded up. A for sale sign hung crooked on the window. Someone had thrown red paint across the door. Creep shop, it said. The words stung, but not because they weren't true. They were, and that honesty, however brutal, was part of the healing. I stood there for a long time, staring at the building that once provided for my family and hid the sickness beneath. I thought of all the women who had walked in unaware, the lives quietly impacted by a secret kept too long. I couldn't undo what had happened, but I could make sure I never kept such secrets again, that I'd never stay silent to protect someone who didn't deserve it. And then, as the wind picked up, scattering dry leaves across the sidewalk, I turned around and walked away from the ruins of what was with the weight of truth behind me, and the future finally waiting ahead. Story 3. My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 31, and for the past 5 years, I thought I was building a life with a man who genuinely cared about me. Heath, my fiancé, isn't a bad man, just broken in ways he refuses to confront. When we got engaged, I was working double shifts as a nurse at Houston General Hospital, trying to secure our future. Heath, back then, had just left his accounting job and was figuring things out while doing freelance gigs. I didn't mind picking up the slack. I believed in partnership and standing by each other when things got rough. Then came Chris, Heath's older brother, a 33-year-old disaster wrapped in denim and poor life choices. Chris had moved to Mississippi a couple years back, chasing an online fling that unsurprisingly fizzled out. Since then, he's been jobless, couch hopping, and calling Heath for help like clockwork. I understood the bond they shared. Their father was abusive verbally to Heath and outright cruel to Chris. Heath carried what he called survivor's guilt, feeling like he owed his brother for being the one their dad didn't destroy completely. At first, it was small things, $50 here, $100 there. I told Heath I didn't like it, but he said it wasn't my problem, that he'd handle it. So I looked away, until I noticed my bank balance wasn't making sense. Strange Amazon charges, Facebook pay transfers I hadn't made. Heath had access to my cards since we merged finances after the engagement. He was better at budgeting. After all, but this wasn't budgeting. This was bleeding. When I confronted him, he admitted it. Chris needed help. He's living in motels. Nat, he's got nothing. I tried to be reasonable. I told Heath we'd set a monthly cap $200 tops, and it would come from his freelance money, not mine. He agreed. I wanted to believe that was the end of it. Then, 2 months ago, the hospital announced sweeping layoffs. 4 wings closed down. Mine was one of them. Just like that. My income was gone. I filed for unemployment, tightened our budget, and went into survival mode. Heath promised to step up. He started working more, said we'd be okay. I clung to those words like a lifeline. But last week, I walked into our bedroom and found him typing my debit card number into Amazon. I didn't need to ask. His voice cracked as he tried to justify $437 worth of junk board games, books, playing cards for Chris. He's isolated. Nat, he has nothing to do. It helps him cope. I yanked the card out of his hand and stared him down, shaking with rage. We can't afford to sponsor your brother's boredom. Not now. Heath's eyes didn't reflect remorse, just indignation. You got your tax refund. We'll be fine. I get paid Friday. His words stung worse than any slap. That night, I didn't sleep. I just kept thinking, when did I become the villain in my own home for drawing a line? And how many lines would I have to draw before he realized they weren't for control? They were for survival. The next morning, the real breaking point came when Chris called. Heath was in the shower, so I answered. Chris didn't realize it was me. He started talking fast about how tired he was of being stuck, how he needed help buying a used car. My stomach dropped, and I finally snapped. I told him we weren't his damn ATM. that we owed him nothing, that the only thing Heath owed him was the chance to heal, not a lifetime of enabling. Chris cursed me out, called me controlling. I smiled and said, "This controlling bitch owns the card you keep leeching from. Maybe you should get a job instead of spending your days playing poker and pretending it's therapy." He hung up, but the storm wasn't over. Heath stepped out of the shower to find me sitting on the edge of the bed, pale with fury. I told him everything. I told him this was it. Either he cut Chris off entirely or I walk. Heath didn't scream. He didn't beg. He just sat beside me, looking like someone had stolen his compass. And for the first time, I truly didn't know if he'd choose his future with me or the ghost of guilt he's been trying to repay for decades. Heath didn't talk to me for the rest of that evening. He wasn't angry, at least. Not in the way people throw tantrums or slam doors. He was quiet in that eerie, exhausted way that made the house feel colder. I cooked dinner. He didn't eat. I cleaned the kitchen just to feel like I was doing something. Anything. That made sense in a moment when nothing did. The silence dragged until bedtime. I slipped under the covers and stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, waiting for him to either speak or leave. But instead, he climbed in next to me and whispered, "I don't know how to stop feeling like I owe him." That was the crack in the wall, the first real sign that maybe he understood. I turned to face him and said, "You don't owe him your future, and you sure as hell don't owe him mine." The next morning, Heath said he would talk to Chris, said he needed time to figure out the best way to set boundaries. I didn't argue. I just nodded, because deep down, I knew this wasn't just about money or stolen debit cards. It was about identity, about who Heath believed he had to be, even if it meant destroying the life we were building together. Over the next few days, Heath seemed to try. He didn't send Chris anything, and he even started depositing more into our joint account. He made dinner twice, kissed me more often, and mentioned he was looking into a full-time role instead of contract gigs. I wanted to believe this was the beginning of something better. But then came Friday night. We were watching a documentary when Heath's phone buzzed. He turned it over fast, but I saw the name Chris. I didn't say anything, just waited. A few minutes later, he got up, claiming he needed to check on a client invoice in the office. He was gone for nearly half an hour. When he came back, he had that look again, the one where his face is calm, but his eyes are miles away. I didn't ask what Chris wanted. I didn't need to. My gut told me everything. The next morning, I checked our bank account while Heath was out running errands. My tax refund, it was missing $1,200. A Venmo transfer split across 2 days, probably to avoid alerting me straight to Chris. I didn't cry. Not this time. I just sat there, staring at the screen, and felt a kind of rage so clean it was almost cold. This wasn't about guilt anymore. This was betrayal. When Heath returned, I held up my phone like it was evidence in a trial. "You lied to me," I said. He froze, then sat down across from me and buried his face in his hands. He was desperate. Nat. He said he'd be evicted. He promised to pay me back. I couldn't even laugh. "Heath, we're barely covering our bills. I'm unemployed. You stole from me to fund the man who's already dragging us under. And you lied about it." He looked up, eyes rimmed red. I didn't know how to say no. I didn't want him to hate me. And just like that, it hit me Heath wasn't afraid of losing Chris. He was afraid of losing the version of himself that could fix Chris. The hero, the savior, the good brother. But at what cost? I stood up and walked to the bedroom, pulling out a suitcase. Heath followed me like a ghost. "Wait, what are you doing?" I didn't stop packing. I need space. I'm not throwing everything away, but I need to see who I am without this toxic cycle. I need to know if I'm still me without the constant weight of your brother's mistakes crushing our relationship. He tried to hold my arm. I flinched. "Don't," I said. Not in anger, but exhaustion. Don't try to hug me after betraying my trust. That's not love. That's manipulation wrapped in comfort. I booked a week at a friend's place across town. As I shut the door behind me that night, the silence was different this time. It wasn't empty. It was mine. But deep down, I also knew Heath wasn't the only one who needed to decide who he was without Chris. I needed to figure out who I was without Heath. I spent the first 3 nights at Clara's house, sleeping on her guest room couch, trying to make sense of the twisted knot my life had become. Clara was one of those rare friends who didn't push, didn't demand an explanation. She just poured wine and sat next to me in silence until I was ready to talk. On the 3rd night, I finally broke. I told her everything about the debit card, the money transfers, Chris's entitlement, and Heath's inability to set boundaries. I expected judgment. I got compassion. "I've seen this before," Clara said. "Some people think loyalty means setting themselves on fire just to keep others warm. The problem is, they burn everyone around them too." That line hit me like a slap. Meanwhile, Heath texted, every day, not long, emotional paragraphs, just small, quiet messages. "I miss you. I'm sorry. Please come home. I told him no today." Each message felt like a pebble thrown at a stained glass window, enough to tremble the structure, not quite enough to shatter it. I didn't reply. I needed to know if this silence would force him to confront his choices. Then, on day 5, Clara handed me her phone. "You need to see this." It was a Facebook post. Chris had gone on a full-blown rant. Public, angry, entitled. "My brother's fiancée thinks she can control our relationship. She's been poisoning him against me. Newsflash. Lady family comes first." There were dozens of comments, some defending him, others telling him to grow up. But what shook me the most were the likes. Heath's name was right there. He hadn't commented, hadn't defended me, but he'd liked the post. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, disbelief flooding every nerve. Was this who he was when I wasn't looking? I called him that night, no warning, just hit call and listened as it rang. He picked up instantly. "Nat." "You liked his post," I said. Flat. A pause. Then, "It wasn't." "You liked the post where he publicly trashed me." "Heath, there's no misclick here. You read it. You supported it." He stammered. I didn't mean anything by it. I just didn't want to make things worse with him." "And what about with me?" I snapped. "When do I matter? Heath, when do we matter more than your brother's ego?" Silence. Then, quietly, "I'm trying." "No, you're choosing, and right now, you're choosing him again." I hung up. That night, I didn't cry. I felt strangely clear. I walked out to the backyard and sat under Clara's string lights, letting the night air cool the fire in my chest. I realized then that this wasn't about a stolen debit card. It wasn't about Chris, or even Heath's loyalty. It was about the erosion of trust, how it didn't crumble in an explosion, but wore down, drip by drip, until there was nothing left. The next morning, Heath showed up, no warning, just the sound of his car pulling up in Clara's driveway. I watched him from the window. He stood outside, holding a small bag, looking like a boy who had just lost his way home. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Want me to make him disappear?" she asked, half joking. I almost smiled. Almost. "No," I said. "Let's see what he has to say." I walked out, arms crossed, unsure of what I wanted to hear. Heath handed me the bag. Inside was the debit card, mine, taped to a handwritten note that simply read, "No more lies." Then he said, "I shut down Chris's access. I canceled the Venmo. I blocked him." "Nat." I blinked. "You?" "Blocked him." His eyes were tired, but steady. It was either my future or my past. I finally chose my future. I chose you. It should have felt like victory, but all I felt was exhaustion and a quiet voice in my head asking, why did it take this much to make him see? Heath stood there, waiting, hoping. I didn't know yet if I could give him what he wanted, but I knew the next step was mine to make. He stood in front of me, holding out that little paper bag as though it were some kind of peace treaty. My debit card was inside, taped beneath a scribbled apology, and for a moment, I didn't move. The wind picked up just enough to pull at the hem of my sweatshirt, like it too was waiting to see which way this would go. I blocked him. Nat, Heath said again, a little firmer this time. No more calls, no more money. I told him he's on his own from now on. I could hear the resolve in his voice, but it didn't soothe me the way I thought it would. Blocking someone doesn't erase years of choices. It doesn't unswipe stolen cards or undo quiet betrayals. And the part that stung most, I hadn't asked him to block Chris. He waited until I walked away to finally make the one decision I begged for over and over again. I took the bag from his hand, but didn't invite him inside. Instead, I said, "So, what changed?" Heath ran a hand through his hair. "When you left, that first night, the apartment was too quiet. I thought I'd finally get space to think, but all I heard was your absence. I kept thinking, what if she doesn't come back?" He looked up at me, eyes raw. I realized I kept choosing guilt over love, and guilt's never loved me back. That was the first time in years he'd said something that sounded like it had come from his own mind and not from the weight of someone else's expectations. I nodded slowly. "And what about Chris? What did he say when you told him?" Heath swallowed hard. "He called me a traitor, said you'd manipulated me and that I'd sold out. Then he brought up our dad, said I was doing exactly what he did, turning my back on him." I inhaled sharply. There it was. The real reason Heath had been shackled to Chris all these years. It wasn't just guilt, it was trauma. That house. Their father. The favoritism. The psychological war that left Chris craving validation and Heath believing love meant atonement. But at some point, love stops being healing and becomes an open wound you keep pressing on, just to feel something. "Do you believe that I asked? That you're turning into your dad?" Heath shook his head. "No. I think I'm finally doing what my dad should have done, telling Chris that enough is enough. That being blood doesn't mean enabling him forever. I just wish it hadn't taken losing you to see it." The vulnerability in his voice wasn't performative. It was the voice of someone who had fallen hard and was still brushing off the gravel from the impact. I didn't tell him to leave, but I didn't invite him to stay either. "Instead," I said, "let's take this one step at a time." And that's exactly what we did. Over the next few days, he kept showing up not with flowers or grand gestures, but with quiet consistency. He brought over groceries one night and cooked dinner at Clara's. He took my car to get the oil changed. He applied to a second job, something part-time on weekends, to help while I looked for work. It was the first time in a long time that he showed love in ways that weren't laced with apology or desperation, just steady presence. Then came the voicemail. I got home one afternoon and saw the notification on my phone. "Chris." I didn't even realize he still had my number. His voice was slurred, bitter. "Hope you're happy now. You broke up brothers." He was all I had. A pause, then, with more venom. "He'll come back to me. You'll see. They always do." It wasn't a threat. It was a prophecy. And it chilled me more than I cared to admit. I played it for Heath that night, watched his face as he listened. He didn't flinch. He just deleted the voicemail, blocked Chris's number again, and looked at me. I'm not going back. But the way his jaw tensed told me it wasn't over. Not yet. Chris wasn't just a freeloading brother anymore. He was a man unraveling. And people like that, they don't let go quietly. The following weekend, I came home from a morning walk to find Heath sitting on my porch. Pale and tense, clutching his phone like it might burst into flames. Without even looking up, he muttered, "Chris showed up in town."
My heart stuttered. What?
He finally looked at me, eyes hollow. He's staying at a cheap motel just outside the city. He said he came to talk face to face, but we both know what that means. I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't need to. The weight on Heath's shoulders told me everything. I had seen this pattern too many times, guilt bait, emotional blackmail, financial threats. But this time, something in Heath had shifted. "I'm going to meet him," he said quietly. I bristled. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" He nodded. "I need to say it in person, not through a phone call, not with silence. I need him to see that I'm done." A few hours later, I sat in the car across the street from the motel parking lot, engine off, watching from a safe distance. Heath had asked me not to come inside, but I couldn't bring myself to stay home. My heart beat erratically as I saw Chris step out. He looked thinner, more tired, but the swagger, the entitlement, it was all still there. I watched the two brothers speak. I couldn't hear them, but the tension was visible. Chris waved his arms. Heath stayed still. Then, Chris shoved him. It wasn't violent, but it was sharp, like a spoiled child being told no for the first time in years. Heath didn't react, just stood there, silent, grounded. Then he turned around and walked away. Chris didn't follow. When Heath climbed into the passenger seat, he exhaled like he had been holding his breath for years. I told him everything. That he was never going to manipulate me again. That he could hate me if he wanted, but I was done. I reached over, rested my hand on his, and he looked out the window. He said I was dead to him, that he wished I had never been born. Silence filled the car like smoke. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the truth behind them. Chris had always believed Heath existed to balance the pain in his life. When Heath finally stepped out of that role, Chris lost the only person who had ever tolerated his chaos. We drove home quietly. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't say anything at all. Some grief needs silence to process. Over the following weeks, things settled into a new rhythm. Heath picked up more shifts, and I finally landed a job interview at a nearby clinic. We started cooking dinner together again, even laughing sometimes, like some part of us had found its way back from the fog. But healing isn't always linear. One night, I found Heath sitting on the floor of our living room, staring at a framed photo of him and Chris from when they were kids. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just stared. I sat beside him, leaned my head against his shoulder. "It's okay to mourn the version of him you hoped he'd become," I whispered. He nodded slowly. "I just wish I hadn't taken so long to see it. I wasted so much of us trying to save someone who didn't want saving." I squeezed his hand. "Maybe. But you're here now, and I'm still here too." That night, for the first time in months, I felt peace settle in the cracks of our home. Not because everything was fixed, but because the hardest part was finally over, choosing ourselves over the people who keep pulling us under. A week later, Heath took the framed photo and placed it in a box in the attic. Not out of hatred, but acceptance. Because sometimes the bravest kind of love is the one that finally lets go. And as for me, I realized something else. Something fierce and liberating. I will never again apologize for drawing a boundary too late. Because I still drew it, and it saved me.